Okay, cool. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about section. Oh man, I'm missing up the numbers. Section 13. If that's right. HTML and web scraping and such. Right? Is that right? Cool. I haven't gone crazy yet. Okay. I see some nods. I think I saw a nod. Oh well. If not, let me know. So this is kind of like I like to say is like we're going down like the list of like in my view what like the really great like ways to get data. So the first way is kind of like in my opinion, like one of the best ways because it's easy. It's like a CSV file. Something that's already tabular form. It's already collected. Put in this nice column feature and stuff like this. There's still like some dirtiness to it, right? We have to figure out like missing values, like we saw in project 1. But the point is that we have this tabular data and we can load it directly into Pandas and go from there, right? Obviously, that's not always the most ideal or the most available because sometimes we have large amounts of data. And so it might make sense, for example, to get from the SQL server. So I kind of think like CSV files, TSV files, those like file formatted tabular data is really great. And then I would probably put like SQL server more or less on that same part where like you still have to kind of like write some code to like import it in, but at least it's going to be in some tabular format and stuff like that. And you can load it directly into Pandas. The next step underneath that, in my opinion, is kind of like the JSON XML file where we have to kind of parse it through. It's not in tabular format, which we really can't do with for our data science, the tools that we use. We have to kind of get that information and put it into a tabular format of some sort. So that's kind of like the next tier down. And then the next tier beneath that is APIs, which we kind of talked about, right, last time, where essentially it's maybe not in a tabular format, but at least then you can ask for it and the website will hopefully respond back to you, get that information, then you can go from there. The very bottom of the barrel, I already said this a couple times to some people, so it's kind of funny just repeating myself. But the very bottom of the barrel, in my opinion, it's kind of like, oh, like if you have to go create the survey, you have to go ask people. Like obviously that's super expensive, a lot of time consuming. So it's almost not even considered. But right above that is like web scraping, and web scraping is what we're going to talk about today. And web scraping is basically you're going through. Essentially, the way I look at it is like if you like were walking through the park and you just got a notebook and you started writing down all the stuff you saw. Which just takes, a lot of time, a lot of effort. Things can kind of change. What path do you take? All these different things. Essentially, you can think of like web scraping like that. And so you can hear like the terms data scientists use, like web scraping, scrubbing, like cleaning. Like I almost feel like we put data down. Like we really say like really bad things about data. And I think it comes down to how much effort you have to put into it. And web scraping can be a lot of effort. It can be a lot of fun too. Don't get me wrong. Like sometimes web scraping is just kind of a cool thing that you can do, but it does take a lot of effort. So just know that going in. But before we can actually talk about web scraping, let's actually know how websites look like and how they're built. So we're going to start basically into HTML first. And let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. And you think I'd be able to do this faster by this point. Okay. Cool. All right, so you guys should now see HTML mostly blank. And I'll move my guy over here. And all my windows get moved over. There we go. Okay, cool. All right, so everyone sees that. A little quick thumbs up. Awesome. Cool. All right, so the first thing we talked about is going to be HTML, which is really what the web is built around. Okay, so HTML, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, and I'm not going to go through all the information that is in here because there's a lot more in the curriculum, a lot more resources. If you were web design, for example, we could go all day, about HTML and the different formats, but we're going to talk about just enough so you can basically scrape it and get the information you want. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So you'll notice that ML, this markup language, similar to XML, which is extensible markup language. Essentially, HTML is kind of a specialized XML. That's really what it comes down to. And essentially is that every website, whenever you go to any website, whether it's facebook.com, google.com, whatever website you go to, something.blog.com or whatever, right? Every time you get past this information, your browser, like for example here Chrome, basically is getting new information through an HTML document. And this HTML document, basically, it's kind of like a Word doc. It just has a bunch of information in it. It's just formatted in a specific way. And so we can actually look at this in a second, but just know that the syntax really is about, our HTML is really what the web's built around, okay? And it's a specialized XML. So going through a little bit, and I wanna make sure this is what I wanna talk about. Yeah, so we're gonna talk about basically the different tag. Like, so we've seen what an XML looks like already, right? So we're gonna talk about all the different specialized tags. So in XML, you can basically put whatever you want as a tag, right? And the HTML, basically, you're only allowed specific tags in here. And basically, your browser will take those tags and translate them into something visual. So kind of similar to, like, for example, just in this notebook, if I use Markdown, you can see here, for example, I use these two octothorpes, these hashtags, right? And basically this will say, okay, make this into a subheader. So you can see here, basically Jupyter Notebook says, oh, that's a subheader, and goes through. That's similar to what HTML is to a web browser. So our first tag is one of the simplest, is basically just the paragraph tag. And basically you can see here is that you are putting information that's a paragraph form. So you can kind of think like when I write like stuff like this, any of these parts would be like a paragraph form. And basically just saying, hey, this stuff is written out, okay? So you can start putting other tags in here. For example, we'll go over a few of these examples. This one right here is a header, and this one's a paragraph right here. And you can see that you always have a start, right, with these tags, and then it goes into the end, just like XML. So this shouldn't look like anything super interesting or super different, other than the fact that it's H1 versus paragraph and stuff like that. This is what it would look like if you have it in code. However, if I go ahead and let's go ahead and, oops. All right, so if I go in this part and actually show you, what's kind of cool is that Jupyter Notebook actually supports HTML directly. So I can actually do this in here. So this right here is what it looks like in the code. But if I actually run it, you can see here, it shows a heading here, for example, and then a paragraph form right here. So you can kind of see a little bit of what that looks, how this is executed through. And that's what the browser does, okay? So those are tags. And then kind of again, going off of like XML attributes. So attributes are within the tags themselves, right? So we have our tag here, and we have our different attributes here. For example, this is href. And basically these attributes are more or less about giving extra information to that tag. So for example, for this one is a hyperlink. And basically hyperlinks are matched with A's basically as the tags. And when we take this part right here, this this attribute, this is basically saying where the website will go to. So you can see here basically is that this is saying, okay, this is the full tag. This is the information that's being wrapped around the tag, okay, and this is a hyperlink. So for example, we can see here, click here for Google. You can see here is that if I highlight over it, you can see the actual web page. And if I click on this, it will actually take me to that hyperlink part, right? So basically just know that there can be attributes within here. We'll also have things like classes and IDs and such like that, which we'll see in CSS. Note that this doesn't have to be valid to be to work well. For example, you might have, you can see here is the actual code of what this looks like. Okay, you can see, for example, I can put something like, let's just say Victor equals A. Okay, this will have no meaning whatsoever. No website's gonna know what to do. You might know what to do, but it'll work perfectly fine. It'll still work just the way you would have it if you ignored it. So know that HTML sometimes basically is very, very forgiving. It just lets you do whatever you want and it tries to figure out the best it can. Compared to Python, if you don't give it the right thing, it yells at you pretty loudly and says, hey, you can't do that. So just know HTML is very forgiving, but also for your actual scraping and stuff like that, you have to be aware of this since you might not have things in there that you'd expect, okay? And then the last part on here is comments. In a comment, basically, it starts with this exclamation, this bracket, or this little, I'm blanking out right now, less than sign, right? Basically a little arrow, exclamation part, and then these two dashes here, that signifies that it's a comment. And basically it means that this stuff will never be shown by the browser. It's still within the code itself, so you can actually find this in the scraping. For the most part, I have not really come across too many situations where I'd actually have to scrape this stuff, but it does exist. And this is more like usually code, like it's explaining the code itself. It's the stuff that's not actually running. So usually this won't matter, but just know that it is there, okay? So just kind of check this out. We'll talk about the HTML structure itself. And so just the easiest way, instead of you just going through this part right here, is I'm gonna show you how you can look at this website. So for example, this is google.com. You can see I did inspect here with a right click. These are things that you kind of look for. And basically this right here on this right here, and what's nice is that Chrome will actually highlight the parts that you're looking over. But basically this website, this part of google.com is literally just this HTML document. And what's kind of nice is that in this inspector, you can see that it has code, it has it folded in there. So I don't have to look at it all at once. So you can see here that's built on these two parts. So going a little bit on our document itself is that essentially the HTML is built into two basic parts. Well, the first part is basically this one right here that's saying, hey, doc type HTML. In reality, this is not really needed to be there because basically all of the web is built off of HTML, at least as of right now in 2019. Maybe in the far future, the web doesn't have HTML and it uses some other kind of format. But they kind of thought about this, so they actually have this doc type HTML. If there are certain attributes, for example, HTML5, that has to be there. This is not so much going to be a concern when you're scraping, but if you were to ever build a website, that's something that you would have to be concerned about. And then you can see here, the first tag, it always starts off with HTML. Basically says, all of this stuff in here is going to be HTML stuff, okay? And so that's how it starts off like this. And then we basically have the two parts, which is head and the body. And so the head really tells like extra information. It can contain like little JavaScript code. It can tell about some metadata information. If you're ever doing like search optimization, this is usually where this stuff kind of ends up being in there. So that's the stuff that you can kind of scrape and find different details about. But this is for the most part not what you see as a user. So if you care about the stuff that you see, most of that will be found actually in the body. And this is where like where all the content comes from. So to show you a real life example of this, is we have Google here. And you can see here, we have our doc type HTML because it uses HTML5, and Google is really good at actually being a good little person in the web, like actually putting in correct HTML code. And we can see here HTML, we also see there's also some tags in here, or not tags, some attributes within the HTML tag. So just know that those things can exist. And then we have our head and our body. And you can see here in the head, it's pretty beefy here. We have some metadata. We also have some script. This style stuff we'll later find out it's called CSS. So basically you can put some extra information in here, links to other things like metadata, basically talking about how to present the stuff, or for example, if you're a bot, saying what this meta information really is about, okay? So that's what the head is. And then in the body is the stuff you actually see, which you probably notice you don't really see a whole lot, but there actually is a whole lot of information within here about what's going on. For example, we have these different divs, and divs we'll talk about in a second. Basically the whole web's like built on divs and basically different sections right now. But basically within here, there's a whole bunch of different sections, and you can see, for example, if I do an inspect element right here, let's see if I can find it. Okay, you can see here is that it's actually an image. You can see here it's Google, so you can basically explore this website. And if we were to scrape it, this is the stuff that we would kind of look for and see exactly what we want. Okay, so that's the basic structure of like the website, and it can get really complicated. So I'm actually going to go ahead and talk about some of the different HTML elements. But before I get into that though, were there any questions about between the HTML document structure, DOM, which is basically the head and the body, and or any part like the comments, attributes, or tags for the syntax? Yeah. Looking pretty good then? Cool. All right, so I'll go ahead and move on to some of the elements. So again, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because there's a whole bunch of resources that you could go into, especially the curriculum. But so if I go a little fast, it's out there. So paragraphs, headers, images, list. Okay, so paragraphs is mostly the stuff that you see, like big blocks of text in an article. It would be basically each paragraph essentially. We would have the headers themselves. So note that headers can basically go from H1, H2, H3. I think it goes all the way to H5 if I'm right. I'm not a web developer, so I don't claim to be. Is it 6? Cool, thank you, Giovanna. So basically know that these basically are different levels of importance. Note that that is what they're intended to be, not how people actually use them. Sometimes people don't use the proper elements for the right things, which it's really fun for scraping because it means that you have to figure out why are they doing this kind of thing, and have to explore a little bit. But know that they're supposed to be basically order of importance hierarchy. So for example, is that something like this 2 right here is equivalent to an H1, basically the first header, and then something like this is an H2 header, which is 2 parts right here. And you can see here is that we have an H3 header. And so just note, so you can see here it's 1.13. That's just how Jupyter Notebook, in my case, or my extension actually does it. I could actually have changed this too, since it supports HTML. I could have done something like this, and this would have been the same thing. So you see here is that it's the same exact format. Of course, because it's an HTML, it doesn't have my nice special extensions. So I'm gonna put that back. There we go. Okay, so that's your headers. Images are probably one of the big part that you might want to scrape for. So it always starts with IMG. Note that you don't necessarily have to have a closing tag right here, this backslash. Usually you will, but you'll see that people kind of go back and forth on it. So kind of just be aware of those stuff. For the most part, if we use a library, we don't really care. But the main part right here is the source. So the source basically is telling you where this image lives. And this can either be like an HTTPS to another website. So if that's true, basically you'll put something outside of this website. But if you have this right here, and you'll notice I put folder path to image, is that this structure here basically says, all right, what you're going to do is you're going to look for, I'm trying to show a good example of this, is that you basically attach, if you were to imagine to just take this part right here and attach it to the end of this, like that, to this URL. And essentially that's what this points to when we have something like this, is essentially is looking for the end of this. In fact, it actually would be like this, sorry. That would be kind of like what that structure would look like right here. And so this is something to be aware of, is that if you're scraping for stuff and you're just thinking they're all pointing to a website and you get to across the source, this will actually be something that's on the actual server itself. And so just be aware that this is how you would reference these images and such, okay? This alt here is used to be just for a little fun thing where you have like a little hover over image. This alt, however, now represents for accessibility, is that basically it's supposed to describe the image that's in here, right here. So in case if someone's blind or can't see very well, or other things like, for example, this is becoming bigger for voice assistants. So if you have a voice assistant, this way they can know what the image is without actually literally looking at it, kind of deal. So sometimes voice assistants go actually read this off instead. So note that this is also some useful information that can be there. Note, however, again, this might also just be poorly managed and just might not represent the thing that you want. So be aware of those kind of things, okay? Lists I want to talk about is just because it's probably usually a lot of information. For example, if you're scraping a bunch of recipes, you probably will come across lists. You'll have unordered list, right? And so basically you have this unordered list and then list items within each part. And then we have ordered lists, which has a bunch of list items in here. And note that unordered lists basically are these bullet points. Ordered lists are more like 1, 2, 3, 4. It'll be listed automatically by some kind of hierarchy structure. And again, that's what they're intended to be. They're not always done. Sometimes people will mix these up just because even like they'll use an ordered list, even though it shouldn't really be ordered, it really should be unordered. But of course, that's just their style and stuff like that. So things to consider when you're scraping. Okay, so those are the really basic ones. These are like the main 4. Okay, cool. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Yeah, just a bunch of information, right? So last one is table. Just because I showed this one, just because this one is probably like, if you come across tables, this is probably where you want a lot of information. So sometimes websites won't store their information in a nice, easy way, and you actually need to scrape it directly from the table. And so, for example, basically it starts off with table, saying that everything within here is a table itself. And you can see here that each table has our different row. So this TR represents a table row. Okay, and that's within the table part. So you can see here, for example, I think this, in this case, is exactly this one. It's this first table row. In this case, I create a header right here. And this basically is showing, it's like, okay, like this is a header right here. Basically, each part is its column. Okay, so you can see header 1, header 0, header 1. This column span, basically, it's a third header. So if I actually, see if I can get into this real quick. I'll just put like 3. Okay. So you can see here is that this third header, for example, can span multiple columns. So for example, I could have done something like this, and you can see here it disappears, but it still works out in strange ways. So just be kind of aware that people can change these things up and it might treat things differently. So anyway, that's your header piece right here. This isn't always present, but usually if it's in there, it usually is talking about each individual column, just like you would think in Pandas. And then these TR rows right here. So again, these are all just different rows in this part, but this TD stands for table data. So each part basically is our table data. For example, this is the data item 0, first column. You can see data item 0, first column. Okay, data item 0, second column. You can see this right here. So basically note that this represents a whole row, and then each one of these TDs represents a single point right here. And note that they can be formatted in interesting ways. You can see here, for example, I have just one header, header 0, and then header 2, which spans 2 columns. And then you can see here I have a row span. It basically spans 2 rows, and you can see the weird looking this in this case. In this case, this item 0 is going to cover 2 different rows. You can see here that's what's happening on this part right here. So again, be aware that like basically people can have weird formatted tables and stuff like that. So just know things happen. Okay, so that's tables. This is like if you come across a table, this is like if you're trying to scrape a website that has information on it, you'll probably be scraping it from a table. Okay, cool. Any questions so far? Cool. All right. And then last part for HTML, just know that there's basically other tags that you can use. As I mentioned before in Google, you can see like this div tag right here. Okay, this .div, I know it's really small, right? I hope you guys can see it okay. But you can see here that the different tags, there's a lot of divs you can see all right here. And HTML5 basically allows you to put other parts of there to help signal to say, oh, this is a header, this is a navigation bar, this is a footer, this is an aside, this is an article, which again, in concept should be expressing certain things, but people don't always necessarily code in that right way because it's kind of a Wild West. No one's in charge. Anyone can do whatever they want. So just kind of be aware of that. These basically can be represented by divs, but they hopefully give more information about these parts. So you might see these in HTML5. Okay. So that's kind of like a quick overview of all of HTML stuff. Any questions on that? Pretty good? Okay, cool. So that brings us to the second part, which is CSS. And CSS is, I'm going to tell you it really quickly, is basically just, it's taking the HTML structure and just changing how it looks. So that's like really simplified because there's a lot of stuff you can do with CSS. If we were a web development class, the UI UX like bootcamp, for example, we would talk a whole bunch of how you would do all these different things with CSS. But for the most part, we're not really going to scrape too much on CSS just because it's the same structure and all we care about is the structure of the data, not really about how pretty it looks. But if you wanted to, you could, for example, do this stuff. And these are especially useful when we talk about class and ID. So you can see here, for example, in the CSS, in the CSS code, you'll see like a dot, of the name of the class or a hashtag of the name of the ID. And basically within the tag itself, which is what you'll see in the structure, you might see class is equal to, class is equal to like robot text, which means like that is the class robot text, but you can have multiple classes. For example, this could be robot text in friends. So those are 2 different classes. So this might be helpful if you're trying to scrape and find specific parts and you find out like, oh, for example, everyone whose profile picture, maybe it has a class profile. And then you can find all the ones with the tag that has the class profile and you can do that. ID is something similar, but ID basically it's like it can be the only one that has that ID. So this can be important, for example, if you wanted to look for something like, on someone's like web page, you're looking for like the title or something like that. It might have something like ID equals title or something like along those lines. Okay, so these are things to kind of consider and note that the CSS basically is specified as an attribute within the tag itself. Okay, and there's other stuff you could do with this. Like this is what HTML or CSS looks like. But to be honest, you're not going to scrape this. I mean, maybe one day you find something, a use case, but for the most part, you're going to be scraping the HTML structure itself and looking at by either class or ID. Okay. Any questions? All right. So that is CSS and HTML, which is pretty much like all you would be using. Well, not all you'd be using. You'd be using other stuff too, but this is a big part of like web development. If we like rewound like 15 plus years to web development, you basically have everything you have to make websites now. So kind of interesting. But what we really care about this is not because we're going to make websites, you could if you want, but the real important part is that we want to scrape this stuff. So this leads us to our web scraping.